As an actor, my business is words. I learn them, I interpret them, I communicate them. But there's one word no actor's allowed to say. Just to speak it out loud would bring down a terrible curse. It's 2 syllables, it's the name of a play, it's the name of a king. What's the word? This is where the legend started, in Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. It was here that the men and women in the street would have stood to watch what we now call the Scottish play. And what would they have got for their money? Treachery, murder, and more scariness than the Blair Witch Project.
Double, double, toil and trouble.
Its hero is a man who hangs out with witches and the spirits of the dead, and not only kills a king and murders his friend, but also drives his wife mad into the bargain.
Out, damn spot.
Shakespeare has woven a spell. He's created an unforgettable story. But the most fascinating thing is that there really was a real king with the same name living in Scotland 1,000 years ago. And his story is even more compulsive. Now, I'm used to archaeological excavation, but now I'm going to dig down into history to try to reveal the secrets behind that real king. And I'm not going to be superstitious, I'm going to say his name. Macbeth. And I hope Shakespeare won't mind if I reveal a few of the secrets of his most unforgettable baddie. Shakespeare makes us feel we know this man. But the real Macbeth, King of Scotland from 1040 to 1057, is far more remote. Finding the real Macbeth means embarking on a journey that takes us all over Scotland, a journey that begins in the Highlands, Macbeth's birthplace, and the setting for the start of Shakespeare's play.
And looking for Macbeth, what one is really trying to get back to is an understanding of what the old Scotland was like.
He actually killed his own cousin. He should have gone there. He killed his own cousin to get into this position.
The hardest thing to know in the past is what people believed, and it's really hard to get inside the heads of people in the past.
Archaeology can usually bring history to life, but physical evidence from 11th century Scotland is pitifully thin. There was no pottery or coinage at that time, and all the National Museums of Scotland can offer is a solitary axe head. This leaves us with the written records, and the problem here is that the historians were writing such a long time after the event. If we say that the present day is here, and the time when the real Macbeth lived is down there at the other end of the carriage where that bloke's just coming in now, then the moment that Shakespeare wrote his Macbeth, 1606, is about here, not halfway down the carriage. And Holinshead, who was the historian who Shakespeare got his information from, was just 30 years earlier here. So both Shakespeare and Holinshead are nearer the present day than they were at the time when the real Macbeth lived, if you see what I mean. But as we get nearer, Holinshead's sources were even earlier chronicles, but still 300 years away. From Macbeth's time itself, virtually nothing. A few lists of kings and annals from monasteries, but often contemporary sources are the most revealing. And amazingly, we've got a piece of Gaelic poetry from Macbeth's time called The Prophecy of Birchen, which gives us a description of the man himself. Macbeth is traditionally played on the stage as a dark, sullen, brooding character. But the prophecy describes Macbeth as the furious Red King, meaning not his hair, but his ruddy face. It also talks about his flowing, blonde hair. In other words, he was physically the complete opposite of how he's normally portrayed. Such a big discrepancy should ring a warning bell. There's a fundamental difference between fact and fiction.
When shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the huddle-de-buddle is done, when the battles lost and won.
Shakespeare's play opens on a blasted heath like this. A storm's brewing, thunder echoes and lightning flashes. This misty, isolated spot is the haunt of witches.
Where the place?
Upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth.
Into this eerie world comes the Thane of Glamis, the warrior Macbeth. He's just covered himself with glory fighting the Norwegians. His King Duncan thinks he's a great guy. Everything's going right for him. Suddenly, he sees 3 hideous hags.
All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis. All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor.
All hail Macbeth, that shall be king hereafter.
What's Macbeth supposed to make of it? He's always been Thane of Glamis, but what about the other 2 prophecies? The witches vanish, and a minute later, 2 of the king's men turn up and tell Macbeth he's just been made Thane of Cawdor. So the witches got 2 of the prophecies right. What about the 3rd one, that he'd be king? It gives Macbeth big ideas. It's a great start to a play, just like a movie. In fact, audiences got so excited by it that soon people wanted to know where it was supposed to have taken place. And here, which is halfway between Cawdor and Forres, where Macbeth was supposed to be going, became known as Macbeth's Hillock. Cone, please. Dr. Johnson and Boswell came here. Ellen Terry, the actress, came here. Nowadays it's pretty handy for the A96. Brilliant marketing on the part of the Scots, because actually there's no evidence whatsoever that that hillock has anything to do with the real Macbeth. So, if you can't start your search for him here, where can you look? So, Cawdor, perhaps? Cawdor is a small village near Inverness, about 15 miles from Macbeth's Hillock. In the play, Macbeth becomes Thane of Cawdor, and people have liked to think of Cawdor Castle as his home, right down to an alleged bloodstain in the dungeon. But this turns out to be another red herring. The castle wasn't built until 200 years after Macbeth died. But actually, the starting point of the search is easier to find, because the real Macbeth was never Thane of either Cawdor or Glamis. In fact, he was never a Thane at all. A Thane was just a local boss. Macbeth was a warlord who ruled with absolute power in his Highland stronghold. He was Mormar of Murray, and this whole area was his territory. Just like in the play, there really was a King Duncan of Scotland, and the real Macbeth was vital to him politically. Scotland was under continual threat from 2 directions. The English Northumbrians were pushing from the south, and Macbeth in Murray was Duncan's vital northern defence against the Viking raiders who controlled much of the far north. We don't know exactly when Macbeth was born, sometime in the early years of the 11th century. We do know that in his early teens, he had to flee for his life when his cousin killed Macbeth's father and took over the Mormarship. In 1035, Macbeth took his revenge, burning his cousin alive with 50 of his warriors, taking his title, and astonishingly, marrying his widow. Gruach is the woman who Shakespeare turns into Lady Macbeth, and she was a member of the royal line in her own right, as she was King Duncan's aunt. But does the fact that she married her husband's murderer make her as cold as she seems? Might she really have loved him?
What has love got to do with it? I mean, come on, we are talking about the 11th century here. Now, if you're a woman from a noble or a royal bloodline, you're going to be married to the person who's going to take that bloodline on. And it has to be somebody who can do well in battle. We know nothing about Gruach as a person, except her name. We know her name. She's the first Scottish queen whose name we know. And we also know that she was very generous and that she gave land patronage to the Coldies, a kind of Celtic monk at Loch Leven in Fife.
The real Macbeth and his wife seem to be very different from Shakespeare's characters. He's not a thane, but a warlord ruling a virtual mini-kingdom. She's a saintly relative of the royal line, funding the production of manuscripts by hermit monks here on a tiny island in the middle of Loch Leven. But there are parallels. Macbeth has got where he is by being a good fighter. King Duncan is absolutely dependent on him in the fight against marauding Vikings from the north. And it's here we get our first real historical link between play and person. Early in the play, Macbeth is rewarded for defeating the Norwegian king Sweno. And we can prove that battle happened. In the Chronicles, we hear how the Scots fought a sea battle against raiding Vikings. They were defeated, the decks were awash with blood, and the Scots fled back to the mainland. The Vikings came inshore after them, and at Torfness, just north of Inverness, the Scots were thrashed again. Not the massive victory that Shakespeare created to bolster Macbeth's military reputation, but here we have some real evidence to support the Chronicles. This is Tarbert Ness, the Torfness of the histories. The present church's cemetery ends here, but 1300 years ago there was a massive Pictish monastery complex on this site that stretched into those meadows over there and right down into the present-day car park over there. In this funny little area here, archaeologists have come up with a really great find. Evidence of burning covering rectangular stone buildings which can be dated back to the mid-11th century, which fits in beautifully with a series of Viking raids and reprisals in 1035, culminating with the Battle of Torfness. Not only can we establish that this battle was real, we can also get an idea of what it might have looked like. In the 18th century, the locals discovered a very old stone in Forres where Shakespeare set his action. It showed a battle of about the right date, and knowing their Shakespeare, it seemed natural to them to call it Sweno Stone. It's a masterpiece of Celtic carving. On the back, a mass of intricate patterns. But on the other side, carnage. There's soldiers arriving for battle. Here's a battle scene. Got a couple of horsemen here, some foot soldiers. And up here, a horrific post-battle scene. Below that hut, there's a pile of severed heads. And over there, a row of decapitated bodies. These people took no prisoners. For nearly 200 years since that stone was first discovered lying in a field, people have thought that it was about Macbeth's defeat of Sweno. But although we now know it was probably from a slightly earlier period, what it does do is to give a graphic illustration of what life must have been like around Macbeth's time, in what people now call the Marcher Society. For Macbeth, going to war was normal rather than exceptional. Brutal killings were an accepted way of settling disputes and establishing status. A warlord like Macbeth would expect the menfolk from his lands to join in, many of them without armour, as protection was a luxury of the rich. So what would you have used one of these pole weapons for?
This would have been about keeping you as far away from your opponent.
In an old Pictish hill fort, I got a crash course in 11th century battle from a very big weapons enthusiast.
Disembowel him, hit him up in the throat, but you would damage the ligaments, poking that in the top of the foot, somebody's arm or leg. You know, you're stabbing, you're slashing, you're uppercutting, disemboweling. You're aiming for ligaments, you're catching the back of the guy's leg, crunching bones, obviously for piercing or slashing. It's outwards, you try to hit outwards.
The easiest way to imagine a battle of Macbeth's time is to think of a riot situation today, only with both sides hacking at each other at arm's length with deadly weapons, some as simple as household objects.
That would have been short, brutal and very bloody.
When you say short, what sort of time span would a battle last?
You're probably looking about 30 minutes.
Why so short?
Because of the small numbers, it wasn't done on a massive scale that we imagine the medieval wars. It was done short skirmishes, so it was totally brutal.
So the battle with the Norsemen looks like it was a pretty bloody affair. But what about an even gorier bit of the play? The killing of King Duncan. After the battle, Macbeth meets up with Duncan, the epitome of the gracious king. He congratulates Macbeth on his military success, but then reveals that he's going to make his son Malcolm king after him, which, as far as Macbeth's ambitions are concerned, is a bit of a stumbling block. But he gets a horrifying window of opportunity when the king announces he's coming to stay with the new Thane of Cawdor and his wife. Macbeth hurries home to make preparations for a desperate murder plot. Egged on by Lady Macbeth, who sneers at him for being lily-livered, he slaughters Duncan in his bed, then pins the blame on Duncan's servants, who he swiftly executes. Sensing danger, Duncan's sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, flee to England, and Macbeth immediately accuses them of being behind the murder. But Macbeth's friends, Macduff and Banquo, aren't quite so sure. They know about the witch's prophecy, and they suspect that the finger of blame points fairly and squarely at Macbeth, who's already shot off to Scone to be acclaimed as king. It's one of the great murders of literature. But when we look at the real Macbeth, his path to the throne may have been different, but the route was just as bloody. Shakespeare's Macbeth murdered his king Duncan while he slept and spawned a cottage tourist industry for people wanting to see where the deadly deed took place. Johnson and Boswell, hot on the tourist trail from Macbeth's hillock, thought Inverness Castle fitted the bill perfectly. Sadly, Johnson hadn't got as far as gullible in his dictionary. There was no castle here before 1412. Again, the earliest chronicle fragments present us with a different story. The real Duncan wasn't murdered in his bed, but slain on the battlefield. He was fatally wounded here, at Pitgaveny. A wandering monk, Maelbrichter the Hermit, who wrote a chronicle of world history just 20 years after Macbeth died, states quite categorically that Duncan was killed by the warlord Macbeth at a place called the Hut of the Blacksmith. And a later historian adds that Duncan was mortally wounded in a skirmish, then carried the couple of miles to Elgin Cathedral to die. I'm right in the heart of the enemy's lair now. This is the headquarters of the clan Duncan, the very same Duncans who trace their roots right back to the Duncan who Macbeth killed. And strangely, they seem to think that Macbeth had every justification for doing so.
Macbeth wasn't the bad guy that Shakespeare pointed out. Within the terms of his own culture, he was actually quite a good king. And when he was making this bid for the throne, he was only adhering to a Celtic inheritance system, which was normal for the time.
What do you mean, a Celtic inheritance system?
Well, in our system we use today, we keep thinking of the eldest child, particularly the eldest male child, inheriting the throne directly from his father. In the ancient Scoto-Pictish kingdom, that wasn't the case. What you actually had was a kind of royal kin group electoral college system in which a king could be selected from this kin group as long as he had been descended from one line of the family or another.
Okay, so how did that work with the Duncan?
Well, okay, we start with this
Ron
system, and then
explained
on
that under
his
the
death,
age-old
when he
system of
died in
tanistry,
859,
the kingship zigzagged between two branches of a wider royal family,
when he died,
both
it
tracing
did in
back to the
fact
first
go
king, Kenneth MacAlpine. And both branches
dies.
expected a fair crack of the whip.
We're into the story. This is Malcolm II, the greatest king in Western Europe, he was described as. And he was aware of
Then,
those
in the
European
11th
principles
century,
in his own
Malcolm
kingdom.
II committed a
That was saying,
unilateral
"You're
act
going
of
to inherit the
self-interest.
throne." Now, this was quite a different pitch altogether.
He had no
Then
sons,
we have
but in
the
defiance of
outbreak of
tradition,
prison killing.
he announced he was putting
Now,
his
what he
grandson,
did do, he lived
Duncan,
sufficiently
on the
long to
throne
place
after
his
him.
grandson, the Duncan of the Macbeth fame.
Ah, this is where we're into our story.
Yes, and he's made sure the succession is going to, and that was his wish that it goes to him. He's trying to get this direct, linear system in go. And then, of course, Macbeth comes along and kills him.
That would have been absolutely justifiable given the old...
Absolutely.
Christmas system.
Macbeth was saying, hold on, it's my turn.
Yeah.
Because he's descended from that line of the family. Macbeth was correct in what he wanted to do.
Killing Duncan was only the first step for Macbeth. He was now vulnerable until his claim had been ratified by his peers. He had to race south of the Highlands to claim his throne. Most people think of the crown as the ultimate symbol of kingship. But 1,000 years ago, the real Macbeth wasn't interested in emeralds and rubies. The stone that interested him was this 336-pound block of Perthshire sandstone, the Stone of Destiny, the Coronation Stone of Scotland. Macbeth wasn't crowned. In order to be accepted as king, he had to sit on this very stone and be acclaimed by his nobles. Today, the stone's kept with the crown jewels in Edinburgh. But for the real Macbeth, the political epicentre was 40 miles to the north, in the little town of Scone. It's here that he raced in both play and real life to be acclaimed king.
Are you allowed to come over? Bring your fags as well. You can smoke. This was in fact the geographic centre of what was then Scotland. Very prominent religious, very important religious centre. Being the geographic centre of Scotland, it was here Kenneth MacAlpine brought the famous Stone of Destiny.
Scone Palace today would be unrecognisable to Macbeth. There's a 19th century palace and chapel and a concrete replica of the Stone of Destiny, chocked up on a couple of blocks and left to the mercies of the weather and tourists. 1,000 years ago, there would have been a vast abbey church extending from here all the way down towards that car park over there. When Macbeth was being made king, we think that something like this would have happened. The Stone of Destiny would have been taken out of its usual resting place in the abbey church and then processed all the way along here up that mound, which is called Moot Hill. And then Macbeth would have been led in procession, surrounded by bishops and other senior clerics, all the way up to the top of it. Surrounded by his nobles, he would have sat on the Stone of Destiny, which we think would have been slotted into some simple kind of throne. And once he was seated, a bard would have recited a list of the kings of Scotland, which was a pretty long list. There wouldn't have been a crowning, that didn't happen until a couple of centuries later. Instead, he would have been presented with a sword with which to protect his people. And then his nobles would have acclaimed him King of Scotland. In the year 1040, Macbeth had got what he wanted. He reigned supreme. The real Macbeth came to the throne in his early 30s. He and his wife, Gruach, presided over a united Scotland. Macbeth led a peripatetic life, moving through his sparsely populated kingdom and staying in different royal halls and abbeys, which were the political centres of Celtic life. In the play, Macbeth's reign is a disaster. In reality, the king was a huge success.
It was popular in the country was wealthy, but the fact is it was a safe, secure and relatively prosperous kingdom that Macbeth left, ruled from the Highlands. And you know, that was probably the high point of Highland culture.
Macbeth was the last great Celtic king of Scotland. He reigned for 17 years. That's a marvellous accolade. In his time there were fertile seasons. The idea that the prosperity of the king's reign is reflected in the weather and the crops, the very inversion of what comes in Shakespeare's Macbeth, actually, when the times are out of joint and so on.
In the play, Lady Macbeth drags Macbeth into murder and dies a raving lunatic. But in life, they were a team, and Lady Gruach enhanced Macbeth's reputation.
This is a period in which kings of Scots are really fashioning themselves as kings of Scots. They're having great genealogies written about themselves, linking themselves back to Kenneth MacAlpin. This is what's giving them legitimacy. Now, Gruach links to that bloodline. She is Macbeth's most important asset.
On top of all this success, the real Macbeth also seems to have had a sincere religious belief. Contemporary sources tell us that in 1050, Macbeth made a pilgrimage to Rome. It was an arduous journey of 3,000 miles, indicating a great personal conviction and an incredible confidence in the stability of his kingdom if he could afford the many months needed to travel.
We're told that Macbeth went there and scattered money like grains of sand to the poor. I suspect that one of the reasons for the trip to Rome was to try to bind Scotland closer to Europe and possibly too to the European Church.
Shakespeare ignores all of this in the play. His Macbeth is terrifyingly different. Macbeth's friends know too much. He has Banquo murdered and sends assassins to kill Macduff. But Macduff has left for England just in time. The assassins kill his wife and children anyway. But as the country falls apart, so does Macbeth. At a banquet for his nobles, he sees Banquo sitting accusingly in his chair. Only he can see the ghost, and his nobles are treated to the sight of their brave new king gibbering like a lunatic. This is murder fiction. Banquo and Macduff are both legendary characters added by previous historians. But the edge of terror is given by a brilliant invention of Shakespeare's own. The Three Witches. The importance of these witches can't be overestimated. All of Macbeth's actions are motivated by their prophecies.
The important dimension is the issue of witches in the time of Shakespeare. And there had just been a huge witch case, a very sensational case, in 1590-91, the North Berwick case as it's called, when dozens of witches were accused of trying to destroy King James VI, later King James I, through witchcraft. That meant that witches were very current when Shakespeare produced the play, and there were resonances there which everybody would pick up on. Yeah, there had just been a huge witchcraft case, and they had tackled the most powerful person in the land, apparently.
Not only has Shakespeare fixed Macbeth in the mind of the public, he also single-handedly created the popular image of the witch as an old hag huddled over her cauldron.
Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble.
And and he may have put it in as a subtle joke.
Of a fenny sneak, in the cauldron boil and bake. I have newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog.
He has these three witches with an enormous cooking pot, and are throwing absolutely revolting things into it and mixing it up into some foul-smelling and tasting brew.
Scale of dragon, tooth of wolf, witch's mummy.
Scots preferred to eat things like soup, porridge. They preferred to boil the meat, and they often did this in large metal pots. And I personally think that this is Shakespeare having a sly dig at the Scots and their eating habits.
Adaram, Macbeth doth come.
Macbeth can't believe that the great prophecies have got him into such a mess, so he goes back to the witches again to bolster his confidence. This time they promise him, 1, that he'll reign till Birnam Wood comes to his castle at Dunsinane, and 2, that he won't be killed by anyone born of a woman.
Then live, Macduff. What need I fear of thee?
The witches' ability to help or harm played on the fears of Shakespeare's audience. More witches were tried and burnt in the 17th century than in any other age. 5 centuries earlier, witchcraft was far less of an issue.
No doubt people cursed each other, and no doubt people had charms against curses. The church wasn't terribly interested in this. It rather left people to sort out their magical affairs for themselves. You might get the occasional exorcism, you might get the occasional blessing, you might get the occasional curse. But the church didn't want to be seen to be taking the old ways and the old gods too seriously. They preferred to say, if people said they had been riding with Diana in the night or riding with Hecate, you know, well, they preferred to say to them, well, you're making that all up. That's the illusions of devils. They didn't want to dignify this by taking it too seriously.
But witches or no witches, Macbeth was in trouble. He'd killed Duncan. In both play and real life, Duncan's son Malcolm had survived and was out to avenge his father and take back the throne. Malcolm had forged an alliance with the hated English and was marching north to get Macbeth. It was payback time.
Led on by Malcolm, his uncle Siward, and the good Macduff.
Near Birnam Wood shall we well meet them.
What does the tyrant?
At Dunsinane he strongly fortifies. Some say he's mad. Others that lesser hate him do call it valiant fury.
In Shakespeare's story, Macbeth is safely holed up in his castle at Dunsinane, awaiting the attack of Duncan's son Malcolm and the Northumbrians. And here there's a fair degree of agreement with the chronicles. In 1054, Malcolm launched a major bid for the Scottish throne, with the aid of the Northumbrians, led by Siward, who also appears in Shakespeare. But where was Macbeth? Was Dunsinane his stronghold? This is Dunsinane Hill, Shakespeare's Dunsinane, and referred to in the chronicles as Dunsin, or even Dunsian. There's nothing here now except for a few stones, but there are good reasons for believing that this is Macbeth's fortress. You can see south to the Firth of Tay, and the hill's close enough to Scone to stop Malcolm taking the throne without a fight. There's been no recent archaeology. A trench through the middle of the site belongs to a rudimentary 19th century dig. They found some Iron Age remains, but nothing from the 11th century. But it's still likely that Macbeth refortified an older hill fortress in a time of crisis.
We know that the summit is surrounded by multiple stone ramparts. These are massive stone defences. We can imagine that Macbeth utilised the pre-existing ramparts on the hilltop, which he could have strengthened, topping them with some form of wooden palisade.
This is what Malcolm and his forces would have had to face. A single pathway leading to Macbeth's fortress. A formidable HQ for the king and his command centre.
Might have been Macbeth and his closest nobles, his trusted confidants, and perhaps an armed bodyguard, perhaps the Norman castellans who we know were at Macbeth's court. But I think, you know, the majority of his army would have been elsewhere. The hilltop is just too small to accommodate a sizable army, so they would have been in some forward position ready to do battle with Malcolm and Siward's forces as they advanced towards Dunsinane. Macbeth would have been stuck on the hilltop. He could only have won or lost.
The play's reaching its climax. The real Macbeth trusts to military prowess, but Shakespeare's villain is relying on the witch's promise that he won't lose till Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane, or be killed by anyone born of a woman. What he doesn't know is that Malcolm has planned a surprise attack on Dunsinane using a primitive form of camouflage. They cut down saplings in Birnam Wood and create a moving canopy of trees. Macbeth's startled men report back to him that the wood is moving towards Dunsinane. One prophecy down, one to go. The attack begins. Macbeth's men are routed, but he fights on until he sees Macduff in the thick of battle. They square up. Macbeth shouts his defiance. "I've got a charmed life," he says. "No one born of a woman's going to get me." Macduff says that's fine. He was born by caesarean section, not born of woman at all. But he doesn't give up. Shakespeare has him go down fighting. "Lay on Macduff, and cursed be he that first cries hold enough." And then he disappears off stage. We don't actually see him die, but Macduff returns with his head, and Malcolm goes off to Scone to be acclaimed king. That's Shakespeare's version of Macbeth's downfall. How close is he to the truth? Well, the bare bones seem fine. Many of the sources speak of the attack coming from Birnam Wood or the wood moving to Dunsinane. But there's something really strange. Malcolm's army was coming from northeast England over there, and Birnam Wood is right over here. Why did Malcolm's army bypass here, Dunsinane, before he attacked Macbeth? One reason might have been tactical. You have to remember that this landscape would have looked totally different 1,000 years ago. Birnam Wood would have come much closer to here than it is now. It would have been a marshy, difficult, dangerous place for an army to move about in. But if it meant you could get much closer to Macbeth without being seen, it might have been worth it. The other reason was strategic, and lay just a couple of miles to the north of Birnam Wood. This is Dunkeld, on the main artery of the Tay. It was a major rallying point for the relatives of Duncan's line and those opposed to Macbeth. If Dunkeld was a rendezvous for Scottish opponents of Macbeth and Malcolm's English troops, it would give us a reason for the tactical approach through Birnam Wood, which lies between here and Dunsinane. And there's other evidence that the Dunkeld-Birnam Wood approach was just part of a clinically executed strategy.
The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Malcolm's army comprised both land and seaborne elements. The seaborne elements would have travelled up the east coast of England and the east coast of Scotland, and then sailed into the Firth of Tay, and disembarked troops would have approached Dunsinane from the east. The landborne element of Malcolm's army would have wheeled around towards Birnam Wood, and in effect the army would have approached Dunsinane in a pincer movement from two directions.
Take away the witch's prophecies, and Shakespeare got the military history just about right. A carefully executed strategic advance through Birnam Wood by superior forces with the element of surprise. We know the battle took place on a religious festival known as the Day of the Seven Sleepers, which makes it the 27th of July, 1054. Malcolm won a crushing victory. After 14 years of absolute power, Macbeth was defeated. But the end of the story is totally different from Shakespeare's play, because in reality, Macbeth survived and escaped back to the north with his family. Malcolm did go to Scone to be made king, so now there were two kings, Malcolm in the south and Macbeth, a shadow of his former self, clinging on to his home territory in the Highlands. Macbeth was back in Moray. It was the ultimate north-south divide. The mountains provided him with a natural defence, but they also isolated him. He was still popular with the Highland people, but most of his troops were dead. Unlike Malcolm, bolstered by English support, he had no means of getting reinforcements. Macbeth had positioned himself in Dunsinane, a strategic point 5 kilometres north of the principal pass through the mountains. Malcolm could afford to bide his time. 3 years later, in the summer of 1057, he made a forced march through the pass and launched a fatal attack. Macbeth was dead. In an act of symbolic vengeance, Malcolm chose to attack him on the day of the Mass of St Mary, the 14th of August, the same day that Macbeth had killed Malcolm's father, Duncan. By all accounts, the battle was short, and when it was finished, the last remnants of Macbeth's troops dragged him up to this place, overlooking Dunsinane, and buried him under a pile of rocks. And here it is, Macbeth's cairn, his final resting place. But what happened to Macbeth after he was dead is the most crucial part of the story. The warlord's ultimate fate was decided not by swords and spears, but by the sharpened quills of historians. History is written by the victors, and the chroniclers naturally made Macbeth the baddie and Duncan the goodie. But that doesn't fully explain the black propaganda that gradually turned the fictional Macbeth into the epitome of evil. When Shakespeare wrote his play in 1606 here in London, he had his own special motives. This is the equivalent of the royal box at the Globe. James I of England, who was also James VI of Scotland, was Shakespeare's special patron, and the show opened in August 1606, just 9 months after one of the most terrifying political events in James's reign. 5th of November 1605, the Gunpowder Plot. An evil man, inspired by the forces of darkness, tries to overthrow the rightful king. Familiar? The reason that Shakespeare wanted to paint Macbeth as black as possible was politics.
In 1603, Shakespeare's company became the King's Men, and this meant that they had more opportunities of performing at court. And he must have had an eye to the main chance and think of a way of flattering his new employer, and the Gunpowder Plot was an attempt to overthrow the monarch. So Shakespeare portrays a venerable king, King Duncan, who is overthrown, and the mayhem and the crack in the world that follows. He did explore issues that interested King James in the play, issues of kingship, issues of tyranny, issues of witchcraft, which of course James was fascinated in.
That's why Shakespeare's fiction steers so far from the facts. It's why the witches are all important, why Macbeth has no redeeming features. James thought witches were out to get him. He personally interrogated them at witch trials. He said Guy Fawkes was led by the devil, so Shakespeare was playing up to him. But Shakespeare was right in picking on Macbeth as a symbol of threat to the established order. From Malcolm's time onwards, he was a scary figure. Not for what he was, but for the cultural forces he represented.
What Macbeth symbolised was that there was an ever-present threat from the north, from the Gaeltacht, from Gaelic-speaking Scotland, and the kings of Scots from then on had to keep a very careful weather eye on what was happening in the north, otherwise there might be a bid from that part of the kingdom. And they became quite paranoid about that down through the centuries. They were very aware of this threat from the nativist part of the population, if you will.
There's another tradition, that Macbeth was disinterred from his grave in Dunsinane by loyal followers and taken across Scotland to be buried in Iona. The shrine of St Columba on Iona was one of the most holy places of Celtic Christianity. Tradition says that there are 16 early Scottish kings buried here, their graves now unmarked. It would be fitting if one of them is Macbeth, because he was a true champion of traditional Celtic culture. It's a side of his character which doesn't come out at all in Shakespeare, and may help account for the blackening of his name by later historians from a new and anglicised Scotland.
If Macbeth had lived, it would have been a different Scotland, because Macbeth came from the Highlands. He was the last king to govern Scotland from the Highlands. And then, when Malcolm Canmore moved the court south, married an English princess, then the whole orientation of later medieval Scotland took place.
Macbeth was a king in the old Scottish heroic tradition, the man who showed his greatness by feasting, by great generosity to others. And he was succeeded by a man who married an English wife, who turned Scotland round into an Anglo-Norman kingdom, which is very much part of Europe, with the same architecture, the same type of coinage, the same material culture. And if Macbeth had survived, he might have been able to keep Scotland as a Celtic kingdom.
You don't embark on a TV programme like this without knowing roughly where it's going to take you. But as we've been tracking the historical Macbeth around Scotland, trying to find out what he was like from the few fragments and clues that history's left us, something else has emerged, and it's taken me completely by surprise. Shakespeare's play may be a wonderful, bloodthirsty story, but at the end of the day, it's just a piece of entertainment. It now seems to me that when the real Macbeth died, something else died with him. A whole possible future for the Scottish nation. Out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow. A poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard